It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, Labour MP Chris Bryant, Sheffield Star editor Nancy Fielder and Daily Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant. Today... It was a big night for England.
He did score. Fantastic.
Even non-football fans were celebrating. Are we focusing too much on this?
Since yesterday, 9,938 people are reported to have tested positive for coronavirus.
We'll talk to campaigners arguing the Northern Ireland Protocol is unlawful. And Boris Johnson faces Keir Starmer. That's Prime Minister's Questions, live at noon. Let's start with the big news by showing you some of the front pages following that stunning result last night for England. Here's the Sun. 55 years of hurt never stopped us Raheeming. There is Raheem Sterling, who scored the first goal against Germany. The Metro has this. England 2, Germany 0. The jinx. It's all over. That historic match. And this is how they were covering it in the Berlin Courier. That is the German football manager who's been managing them for years, but that was his last match. Obviously disappointing. Yogi's bitterer Brexit. And Nancy, you, of course, have it on the front page too of the Star. Fans celebrate as Three Lions roar to victory. And it was a peak audience of 20 million, perhaps unsurprisingly. Nancy, what was the reaction from your readers?
So absolutely massive in Sheffield. Sheffield has had a torrid time with football this season. Both Wednesday and United got relegated together for the first time ever. We invented the game. We are still the city that has the oldest existing football club. We have Kyle Walker, born and bred here. We have Harry Maguire, born and bred and trained here, and we are absolutely bursting with pride about England, about our local lads, and we can't wait to get further. I don't think I dare say any more than that, but we're very, very hopeful in Sheffield.
Yes, I can feel the pride coming through the television screen. Miriam, you're nodding away there. I suppose after a difficult year, as Nancy was saying, is this what the country needed?
Well, as someone who was also born and bred in Sheffield, can I associate myself with Nancy's comments? I mean, I'm not someone who follows football, I have to admit that, but this is great news for England. And I think the story of the Gareth Southgate redemption is really heartwarming. Ah,
right, yes, of course. His reputation then intact. Chris, you represent a Welsh constituency. Will other home nations be cheering England on?
I'm really chuffed for England. I can't pretend I know anything about football at all.
Don't worry.
But I was really pleased to see that both the German captain and the England captain were both wearing pride armbands. I thought that was really nice. I thought Gareth Southgate has proved himself to be a better politician. Well, lots of footballers this year have proved themselves to be better politicians than most of us. So I'm really chuffed for England. I'm Welsh. Can I stop now?
Yes, you can. But thank you for that. Very heartwarming. Let's take a look at these pictures of the Prime Minister watching.
yes!
He did score. He scored.
Fantastic.
Well, Madeline, I know you couldn't see that, but that was the Prime Minister watching outside in the gardens at number 10. He wasn't completely convinced at the beginning that Raheem Sterling had actually scored. And I suppose that then nods to my question to you. Does it matter that he's not a natural football fan, as we have a few here on the panel too?
Well, I think as long as he doesn't start trying to make grand claims about being one and then embarrassing himself in public, I think, like many of us football Philistines 99% of the time, and then for these big matches we will watch it and we will get wrapped up in it, because how could you not? I just thought it was a bit unfortunate that in the picture that was shared from number 10, it kind of looked like he was awkwardly perched on a coffee table rather than sitting properly, so it didn't look like the most convincing spectator, but I guess he's got plenty of time to work on it.
Yes, well, he's got till Saturday, I suppose, if watching again at the quarter-finals. Let's take a look at this headline in the Daily Mail. Is it time to ditch the daily COVID stats? MPs and scientists say publicising infections and deaths every day frightens people. These are the data from yesterday, coronavirus daily data. New infections, nearly 20,500. Deaths, 23. Bearing that in mind, Miriam, do you think it's time to stop publicising that data?
Yes, I do, especially the data of the positive tests, because I think now that well over 80% of us adults have had our first injection, hospitalisation is very low, deaths are extremely low. The positive cases is actually fairly a meaningless statistic now. And actually, as a scientist, it really worries me, the lack of context and interpretation that we're giving this. I mean, 20,000 new cases, but in December last year, when the new cases was a similar rate, ONS stats show that there was about 5 times the community prevalence that there is now. We're doing 1 million tests a day. Of course, we're going to pick up a lot of cases, but publishing the daily testing cases just drives fear, and it doesn't give us the interpretation and the context that we need.
Do you agree, Chris?
I hate to say this, but I do, broadly speaking, agree. This is going to be a terrible programme.
Oh, thanks for that. Well, let's just hold that judgment for now.
But if I have a complaint about the news and the way that the whole thing is presented, is that what happens is the presenter of the programme, or the anchor, will say, this is the story, blah, 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 blah. Then a journalist will do a package about it, saying exactly the same words often, and then the anchor will interview the person who did the package. You'll hear the same thing 3 times.
But do you think we should stop? But do you think we should stop publishing the daily?
Stories.
Yeah, but the daily data, should it be there or not?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it should be available. And I put up the daily or weekly, we get it weekly in Wales. We put up the data for my local area every week because people do want to know what the prevalence rate is. Obviously, it's much lower in Wales than it is anywhere else in the UK. I think that's because we've done a better job. We've been a bit more cautious. What I'm really worried about is when all this talk about a terminus on the 19th of July, which may be just England, I think that is a fib. Because the truth is we will still have test and trace. As I understand it, the government is intending to keep that till next March. It's certainly paying for it until next March.
Right.
And if people are still being pinged, it will mean that people who run pubs, for instance, will suddenly find, as I heard about one case yesterday, the whole pub had to close for a fortnight because one person had been in contact with somebody who'd been in contact with somebody
and
who was
I understand
positive.
that is something that certainly the government is looking at in terms of if you are pinged and double vaccinated, you may be able to test on a daily basis. We don't know yet, but
that's a problem for pubs because lots of younger staff haven't been double vaccinated.
Madeline, to the question initially, though, that the daily publication of figures, should that end? Does it frighten people?
Yeah, I think it does. I really think that it's been one of the key things that has driven, during the pandemic, a skewed perception of risk. Since, as Miriam said, the figures are read out without any kind of context. For example, on its own, a number like 50 dead might sound very scary, but without knowing what is normal for death, what the numbers are of people dying from other things. I mean, I've no doubt that if we were to publish every winter, if we were to start publishing daily flu stats, that we might well see annual flu lockdowns. I think that Chris Whitty and others were right when they said that we're now at a stage where the focus really ought to be on things like hospital admissions and deaths, since the vaccines have so convincingly broken the link between cases and those figures. And in fact, the fact that we're still using much the same public health messaging, and as Chris said, that we're still operating the test and trace system in much the same way, it almost suggests that we don't share the belief that the vaccines work.
Right, I mean, Nancy, there was a time, and maybe there still is for many people, that we used to literally wait for those figures on a daily basis, and people will remember phrases that many politicians have used. It's data, not dates. Well, that's partly why they publish the data, not just on deaths and hospitalisations, but on vaccinations too. Do you think it would be easy to stop those daily publications of figures?
Well, I'm happy to go out on a limb. I think it would be completely wrong to stop them. I understand that they need more context, and I understand that they can be concerning, but there is so much information and data that we can't get out of politicians already. Why would we take away something that we have? What we need is more data for the people who want it. We need journalists to be sensible, and maybe it's journalism conversations here. Actually, how are we dealing with this? Have we got enough context? Are we doing too much? But taking the data away is fundamentally wrong, and we already have freedom of information requests that are just flatly refused, even when they should be accepted. And I think no data can be too much. It's for journalists to work through it and work out what the best way is to present it.
Miriam?
Well, I have to disagree with that, because I think that data without context is actually very dangerous. And you look at a statistic like the number of people in hospital with COVID, for example. Well, back in October, one of the last peaks, I know that in some hospitals in this country, only 25% of that figure were people that have been admitted with COVID complications. The rest were people who've been admitted and found to have COVID or caught COVID in hospital. If you look at that figure, it doesn't tell the story. You either publish an enormous amount of data with comparisons, with context, or you are much more circumspect about what you publish, because what we're seeing at the moment doesn't actually tell the truth.
Nancy?
What is wrong with giving us a massive amount of data then? Let's have it. And then when decisions are taken, people can scrutinise what the government is doing and see whether they think it's the right thing. I just think we're in a world where actually there isn't as much information coming out as there should be. And I'm not saying it needs to be these figures alone. I'm just saying that suppressing data is absolutely never the right way to go.
I mean, Chris, you're bursting to come in just to show people, which you probably already know, the BBC News story, COVID, no weekly deaths reported for first time in Wales. I think that's been for a
week.
Funnily enough, it says weekly. Yes, for a week.
Exactly. We've had days when we haven't had a death. And that is really good news. And interestingly, the Channel Islands, the only place in the UK that you can travel without any restrictions at all is South East Wales. So the figures are really low in my local patch, which is brilliant. I mean, lots of people sticking by the rules. It's been really tough for people.
So does that underline the breaking of the link, and therefore?
Well, I hope it does, yes. And obviously what really matters as we go forward is not necessarily the number of infections, though there is a danger if that rises very dramatically that creates new variants. But it's the number of hospitalisations and how long people are in hospital and whether that leads to deaths. The point I was going to make is I think we shouldn't be hiding the statistics. The statistics should certainly be available, and they should be available in a readily available way. But whether you have to have every night Hugh Edwards doing like a minute of and here's the statistics for this, that, and the next thing, I just think it feels a bit leaden, and also it's a bit confusing for people that you have two different sets of statistics, one of which is, there's since 28 days, and then there's the other set, which is where they've been testing randomly around the country, so you know the prevalence.
Yes, in terms of surge testing. I mean, Madeleine, the figures I read out earlier, I can't remember the precise number, but let's say we are talking around 20,000 new cases on a daily basis. Should we just get used to that? Is that going to be the norm if deaths are anything between 0 and 25? I think it was 23 yesterday.
Well, I would expect that figure to decrease because plenty of people, I got my jab last week, my first jab, plenty of my age cohort in their 20s have just had the one. So we haven't yet got the full protection. So you would expect that to go down. It would be interesting to know where these cases are springing up. I suspect a lot of it is happening at schools. And there, I think we really do need to make a change because it's simply not sustainable. And it's so unfair on the children who've already lost so much educational time and seen their lives disrupted in so many ways. The fact that 1 in 20 school children is currently isolating, that seems completely unsustainable.
And we're going to have to live with it genuinely like flu. We don't test everybody for flu. We don't isolate everybody for flu. Of course, it makes perfect sense if you have got flu, though lots of men I know think they have flu when, frankly, they've got a bit of... All right, well,
about hypochondriacs, we know. But to both Miriam and Chris, those figures, it was just 20.5 nearly new infections, 20,500, that is, and 23 deaths. Are you really prepared to tell your constituents, that's it, that's the new normal, get used to it?
Absolutely. If you tested 1 million people a day... Oh, sorry.
No, you go for it.
If you tested 1 million people a day for the common cold, how many cases would you expect to find? If you tested
and the deaths?
And the deaths? But I think we should publish the deaths, but also alongside deaths from other conditions. But they are extremely low, and this is the point. The cases are now meaningless, and it's also meaningless to test children.
2 years ago, I had stage 3B melanoma, cancer. I was at the time told that there was a 40% chance of living for a year. I think we need to be much, much more focused on a whole range of other conditions, which is why, incidentally, I know you're not going to mention this, but I am introducing a bill related to acquired brain injury, because we have no strategy for dealing, including with, in the UK, for brain injury, which affects 1.4 million people. But we don't put stats up about that on the news every night, do we? Well,
Nancy, do you think your readers would accept those sorts of numbers if... politicians decided, or the government decided, that is just what we're going to have to live with?
Sorry, as in they would accept that.
Let's say 20,500 cases and 23 deaths.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a big push and everybody is fed up of this. I mean, there is still a fear, but everybody wants to get out of it. And there is this element, isn't there, where actually there's a massive backlog in hospitals, cancer, so many different things that are killing lots of people now. So, yeah, I think we have just got to get on. My own kids have been impacted just in the last 2 weeks. One of them's gone straight back into his exams because he's had to isolate and then suddenly been dropped back into school. Neither of them had COVID. And they're absolutely fine, they've gone back in, but it's having massive impact here. But I do think I kind of feel a bit vindicated here because everybody's actually saying what we need is more data, not less data. We just need it on the right things.
All right, well, you had the final word there, so you can claim victory on that, Nancy. Let's just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Sausage war ceasefire imminent, but UK must not engage in negative rhetoric, EU warns. This is about the contested Northern Ireland Protocol. Maros Sefcovic said he was confident 3-month extension allowing British bangers to be sold in Northern Ireland would be granted. He is from the EU negotiating side. We can talk to the BBC's Northern Ireland correspondent, Emma Vardy. Emma, it's not quite as simple, is it, as the headline implies? What is actually going to be agreed?
Well, the EU is set to push back this deadline to September. There was already a grace period when we left the EU from the 1st of January, which meant all the rules didn't kick in straight away. But this ban on chilled meats was always coming down the line, and the UK government was asking for an extension to that grace period to allow supermarkets to change their supply chains so that they don't ship chilled meat over from GB to Northern Ireland anymore, that they can source it from the island of Ireland instead to get around that problem with the ban. So the UK has asked for more time to do this. The EU is saying yes, but it pushes that deadline back to September, and then we'll have the same sort of debate all over again and have to find a solution. So, yeah, it's not quite as simple as that, but it does kick the can down the road a little bit for now.
Well, as you say, this is really about changing habits and behaviour, not necessarily a sort of solution as the British government would like to see it.
Well, a lot of supermarkets and businesses in Northern Ireland have already started to do that, saying, well, look, actually, you know, we knew Brexit was coming when we figured out what it was all about from the 1st of January. And of course, it all got agreed very, very late on. A number of businesses and supermarkets have already started to do that, already started to change their supply chains, source things on an all-island basis. And if you looked at some of the small print on some of the packaging, as I've done, picking goods up from supermarket shelves in Northern Ireland, where some of them used to name farms in GB in England, where they would get produce from. Now it says, you know, this comes from a farm on the island of Ireland. So you can already see things are changing, but they just weren't able to do that in time to keep up with the deadline. So they're now going to get a bit more time to do that. But of course, there are, you know, hugely strong arguments here in Northern Ireland from unionists who are very, very against the protocol, saying this is ridiculous. We shouldn't have this amount of checks coming over the Irish Sea anyway. So it certainly doesn't solve the divisive political rows over the protocol, but businesses are looking at it mostly from a practical sense as to how do we keep the shelves stocked.
Right. Emma, we've just had in, I've just been told, the judgment from the courts. This was looking at claims of illegality by a group of unionists on the Northern Ireland Protocol that we have just been discussing. It's been rejected, their claim. The group and unionists won't be happy. I think we're going to speak to one of them, Kate Hoey, the former Labour MP. What's your reaction? Because I think generally both sides were going to appeal, either the government or the group of unionists who were challenging the legality of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yeah, well, look, this court case was all about unionists arguing that what the protocol does is not only, you know, break the Good Friday Agreement, but it also breaks the Act of Union, which created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And they were making those arguments very strongly in court, hoping that the High Court would find against the government and that would strengthen their cause for trying to call for the Northern Ireland Protocol to be scrapped. As you say, that's just come out in the last few minutes that they found a gate for the government. But either way, look, of course it will disappoint the unionists who brought this case, but they're still going to appeal it. It'll probably go further up to the Supreme Court anyway.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much. So they will most likely appeal, Miriam, to that judgment. What's your reaction?
Well, I'm pleased that the protocol has not been found to be illegal. I think it is a very complex issue, and Northern Ireland is within the UK Customs Union. The EU accepts that, but that creates issues of interpretation, which is why we found it challenging over the last months to find a solution to this. And I do welcome this proposed extension to the grace period. It does give more time to find these good faith solutions that we need, but we can't pretend it's easy. This is a very, very complex issue. But if both sides negotiate in good faith, then let's hope a solution can be found.
Right, but just to be clear for our viewers, this grace period, these extra 3 months or so, is going to be to find alternative sources. It's not going to be to allow sausages, for example, to come from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. They're going to have to find alternative supplies. That was not what was promised by the British government.
Well, the UK government is still very committed to finding a solution to this that is to make sure that goods that are not at risk of being exported into the EU through the Northern Irish border don't face unnecessary checks.
Right, so the alternative is to align to EU rules in order to protect the integrity of the single market.
Is to find a good faith solution where the EU don't continue with a kind of purist approach to this, but a pragmatic approach. You know, we as the UK are a trusted partner to the EU. We can be trusted to mutually enforce different agreements, and I think that is the approach necessary. I do welcome this extension. I hope that a solution can be found. There are going to be changes as a result of Brexit from where different companies source their products. That, of course, there are. But we also need to find a long-term workable solution to the protocol, of which the sausage issue is one of them.
Right. I mean, what's your response, first of all, to the judgment? I mean, it's been rejected, the unionist claim.
I've not examined the case,
I understand.
And frankly, I thought that was all a bit of a sideshow. It just seems a massive own goal to me that we end up with a situation where basically supermarkets and shops in Northern Ireland are persuaded basically to buy products from the rest of the EU rather than from the rest of the United Kingdom. That seems an own goal, but it was not only predictable, it was predicted repeatedly. And it just seems a massive irony to me that the unionists are the people who are effectively dismantling the union.
Right. Well, Madeleine, what about the reaction, not just to the statement, but also that sausages, chilled meats, going from GB to Northern Ireland has become a totemic issue?
Yeah, well, I think that as is often the case with this, you get one particular, what seems like a small thing, but is actually either the tip of the iceberg or something very representative, totemic somehow, of a much broader problem. And certainly, I think the extension to September shows a level of goodwill, which is welcome. Although I must say that the negotiations on both sides have generally been characterised by this kind of right up until the deadline, then a further bit of can kicking, then some more, and you carry on until push really comes to shove and something concrete has to be agreed. So I do see Chris's point about this being something of an own goal, but I also think that taking too inflexible and too prescriptive a line from the EU's perspective has been something of an own goal as well. It's extraordinary how they've succeeded in uniting not just the DUP or even the British government, but all unionists in Ireland. The new leader of the Ulster Unionists complained that the EU is more interested in stopping a sausage roll from getting into their single market than they are in protecting the Belfast Agreement. And I do think there's some truth to that. There are things that should be considered more carefully, such as trusted trader schemes that would allow the easier crossing of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland that doesn't seem to be that level of commitment to this. I'm not. Can the EU really claim that in good faith they are doing their best to uphold that, or are they pushing an overly inflexible line in order to punish?
Chris?
Well, I was just going to say there are other areas as well where good faith would be a really good idea, and a bit more give and take. I've always been in favour of compromise as a politician. We had David Frost in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee last week talking about touring, British artists and actors and performers being able to tour in Europe. It's a really important part of the British economy. And I just think everybody's being utterly complacent about the fact that lots of countries are making it virtually impossible for a British band to tour in Europe. Well, this was predictable and was predicted, but we should, therefore, have got our ducks in a row by now.
Miriam?
But I think it's realistic to say this is a very complicated issue. And if you could kind of draw a Venn diagram of the different considerations you have to make with Northern Ireland, respecting the Good Friday Agreement, respecting the integrity of the UK, respecting the integrity of the EU customs agreement, there's a very narrow piece of shared area there. And finding it is going to take time. It's going to be difficult. And I don't think the fact that it does take time is a sign of failure or that these negotiations go up to a deadline. That's just human nature.
But that's why it wasn't an oven-ready deal, was it? It really wasn't an oven-ready deal.
Was always going to be complex and relied on this good faith issue. And I completely take other panellists' point, including yours, that we need to take the political heat out of this. Of course we do. Well, but that doesn't mean that it's going to take less time.
It's not David Frost's favourite attitude,
and that's obviously the UK's Brexit negotiator in this. Nancy, do you agree the heat's been taken out of this negotiation to a certain extent on both sides? Do you think it's meaningful, this agreement, this extension?
No, I don't. And to be honest, I think it's been very interesting. I think what I've learned most about all of this is speaking to people on the ground in Ireland who write for local newspapers, both sides, who absolutely saw all of this coming. And I've got a colleague on the Star who grew up in Northern Ireland. And when people kind of go, oh, we didn't think it was going to be this bad, it's like, no, we all knew it was going to be this bad. And nobody's hearing that. Nobody is listening. Absolutely. And we have had ages for this. Let's unpick this. We've chosen to be here. I think just under half the country is throwing their arms up and going, yeah, what did you think was going to happen? Yeah. So there really is a duty for this to be sorted out. And it lies with us because we're the ones who wanted this. So it's got to be sorted. And we've got to remember this isn't about sausages. This is about real lives. And actually there is devastation being caused, some might say unnecessarily, across a really, really difficult situation. We knew this was coming.
Yeah,
Madeleine?
Lots of the farms incidentally are Welsh farms.
Yeah, well, good. Right. Madeleine, I just want you to respond because that was really to your point.
Sure. I don't think the onus is solely on us. I think it's on both sides if you're looking at something complex like the Belfast Agreement. And the other thing is simply that I don't think the protocol was ever really expected to be a kind of static entity. You know, its own Article 13 sees it as a live thing that can change in time. And it's up to both sides now to find a way of changing it for the better and making it workable as we go along, because it is complex. But I think we have to move past that sense of people of sort of punishment on either side. We've got to come up with a solution that works.
Nancy?
Absolutely, that is what is needed now. But I don't think blaming the EU is going to help us. What we've got to do is make something that works for the people of Ireland, and we've got to listen to what they want. And it's a really difficult conversation, but it needs to be solved quickly because it's horrible for them. Right.
I mean, Chris, you mentioned earlier, I think you were saying this group of unionists is single-handedly dismantling the union. What do you mean?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious that if now supermarkets and shops in Northern Ireland turn to the EU for all their chilled meats rather than Welsh farms or Scottish farms or English farms, that is slowly, bit by bit, dismantling the union.
Do you agree?
No, I don't. And I think I accept that many of these issues were predicted, and the whole point of the protocol was understanding that it would take time. But just because something's difficult does not mean it's not worthwhile.
All right, we're going to move on and show you this headline in BBC News. Drugs review to recommend policy overhaul to health-based approach. We can talk to Jack Fenwick, Politics Live reporter. It's your story. What have you found out, Jack?
Hi, Joe. So this is the Dame Carol Black Independent Review of Drugs Part 2, quite a snappy title. And this was something commissioned by the government last year. We're expecting that it will be published next month, early next month. And I understand that the big recommendation in this report will be a move to a more health-based approach to drug policy, in particular problem drug use. That will mean a bigger emphasis on things like recovery and drug treatment. Now, the significant thing politically here is that could lead to a much bigger role in formulating policy for the Department of Health and Social Care. At the moment, drug policy is split between lots of different departments, including Health, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, so we might perhaps see a change there. I understand that the other thing likely to be in this report is an acknowledgement that there have been failings in the system after a squeeze on budgets across government, particularly on youth service funding in local government. Now, Dame Carol Black, who has led on this report, is someone who has said in the past that she thinks drug addicts are treated differently to people with other illnesses, so perhaps that could factor in there as well.
What's the reaction been to the story, Jack?
So, Crispin Blunt, the Conservative MP who chairs the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, has welcomed these changes. He says that a health-based approach is backed up by the evidence. However, he would have liked the report to be able to go further. Last month, he was one of around 50 MPs and peers who called for the Misuse of Drugs Act to be changed. But when it comes to this report, the parameters set by the government meant they couldn't look into legislation change. Now, the government have also had their say on this story. They say they're committed to looking at what causes substance misuse, and they're looking forward to working with Dame Carol on her recommendations.
Jack, thank you. Chris, is it time to treat it much more as a health issue rather than a law and order issue?
We broadly do in Wales, much more so, but I think there is a real problem. I don't think there's a sharp dichotomy, incidentally, between treating it as a law and order issue and dealing it as a health issue, because you have to do both. I mean, it's just a fact. I approach this... My mother was alcoholic. It killed her in the end, many years ago now. But through all my childhood years, I just remember how difficult it was to access drug and alcohol services. It's even more difficult today than it was when I first entered Parliament 20 years ago. That is a failure from all of us. Whatever you think about legalising drugs or whatever you think about cannabis, that is a failure. The fact that we have next to no youth service now in the UK, largely because of the financial cuts that were brought in post-2010. There's no requirement on a local authority to have a youth service at all. And in particular, I think in the last 18 months, lots of kids not being in school. What kind of alternative adult role models have they seen in their lives? All of these things need to be looked at in the round. And my bottom line is, I think what the pandemic has shown us is that for the last 30 years, we have had a health service running at 95 to 99% capacity all the time. And that just doesn't work when you've got other things come into the equation. We have nowhere near enough people who are expert in drug and alcohol, and for that matter, eating disorder conditions. And we really have got to wake up. We should be spending 25% more. I'm not speaking for the Labour Party. Before anybody goes, right, oh, Labour's found the magic money tree. I just say you need a health and social care service and a youth service that is properly funded in this country.
Miriam?
Yeah, I think the answer to this is an integrated one, and I welcome this review, and I think a health-led approach is a good one. And we all know people, Chris has just spoken about his own experience, whose promising lives have been destroyed by drugs, and it's clear we're not getting it all right. I think in 2019 there was a record number of drug deaths since
4,500 drug deaths
began.
were recorded in England and Wales in 2019. That's the highest, as you say, since records began. I mean, that is pretty shocking.
It is. We should take a health-based approach, but we also shouldn't over-medicalise it, because I think some of the root causes behind addictions are much wider than just a medical approach can solve. And you see from things like the Alcoholics Anonymous programme, those kind of community strength-based solutions we also need, integrating them with youth service, those kind of things. It's a much bigger problem than just an NHS.
It's so problematic. I mean, I've been to meetings. It relies on you believing in a higher being. It doesn't have to be God, a religious God. But I mean, the success rate is tiny.
I just use that as one example.
No, I understand. I'm not having a go. I'm just trying to strive for, why is it that after so many centuries of people dying of these conditions and families being torn apart and facing all the lies and the pain and the hurt, that we still don't know any more, really, than we did 150 years ago.
No, and it's a very emotional issue for lots of people, the issues of addiction, of drink, drugs or whatever that's associated, and as you say, have torn families apart. And just to put it actually into figures, because we've heard very passionate personal testimony there from Chris. Madeleine, the total cost to society of illegal drugs is around £20 billion per year. Only £600 million is spent on treatment for people with drug issues. That can't be right.
No, I don't think it is. I think that clearly there is a strong link between the use of certain drugs and an associated cost to society. It's enormous. But you don't solve that. The prohibition-led approach hasn't worked for such a long time. It hasn't achieved in the criteria that it really should be achieving at, bringing down deaths, reducing pressure on law enforcement and so on. And often I think an overly punitive attitude has led to proposals that might really help people, that might help people come forward and seek help, and seek help from people who can bring them into some kind of a system. These sorts of proposals have been resisted on the basis of taking an overly punitive attitude. So in Glasgow, which suffers absolutely, some of the worst, possibly the worst drug problems in Europe, they were trying to pioneer a scheme whereby you would set up consumption rooms where heroin addicts could go and take that in a controlled environment where help is available for them if it's needed. And they hoped that would reduce the shocking number of overdose deaths in Glasgow. But the government blocked it on the basis that, that they didn't want to be seen to be giving any kind of endorsement to that. And I think there is also sometimes a problem of treating all drugs in much the same way, even drugs that don't have anything like the same kind of associated health or social costs as say something like heroin.
Right. I mean, Nancy, very moving listening to Chris and his personal contribution on this. And he talked about youth services and the impact that can have. What is the situation in Sheffield when it comes to not just sort of drug misuse and how it's handled, but cuts to services like youth services?
No, I think Chris has absolutely hit the nail on the head here. What we do is we panic and we deal with kids who've stabbed each other. In Sheffield, we've had awful examples of that. We've had murders of people involved in gangs who've been exploited. We have drug addicts sleeping on the street. Do you know, if there's no magic monetary needed, it costs millions more to solve the problem when it's become a problem. And we have had court cases where, do you know what, a little tiny bit of intervention where there was a key problem in their life at the age of sometimes as young as 9 and 10, without much money at all, you can help these people, we can support each other and we can get through it. But actually we just kind of blanket, they get expelled, they get pushed from school to school, and then they become a massive multi-million-pound problem. And there is a solution here. I do believe that drugs isn't about necessarily punishment. Sometimes it is, but actually by that time, society has failed and we've got it wrong. Let's invest right at the bottom. It's not an instant solution, but it is the only solution that will actually bring a positive difference in the long run.
Right, and Miriam, legislation, does that need to change? We heard Jack at the beginning talking about Crispin Blunt, your colleague, Tory MP, saying that actually the parameters should have just been broader. There just needs to be a change to an act that was made decades ago.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know enough in detail to comment on that. I mean, I'm not someone who advocates decriminalisation of drugs. I think the trade itself causes huge damage, but that's not to say we should be treating addicts as criminals at all. But just one thing to add, I'm very encouraged by Andrea Ledsam's review into the first 1,000 days of a child's life. And one of the key recommendations in that is that parents, at the very start of their child's life, if they need intervention, if they have addiction problems of their own, that's when those things should be tackled, support should be given, so that you don't get this kind of generational continuation of some of these issues.
Final word to you, Chris.
One flaw in Andrea's report, which I broadly like, it doesn't make enough mention of brain injuries. Sorry to come back to this, but it's a fact that kids from poorer backgrounds are 4 times more likely to have had a significant brain injury by their 5th birthday than from wealthier ones. Quite often that goes undiagnosed. There's no support for that child. Or if they do, and it's later in their life, they go into school, they may have mental problems, which go undiagnosed, untreated, uncared for. 6 months later, the teacher thinks this kid isn't turning up, isn't behaving properly. They end up falling out of the school system. They get excluded. They end up in the criminal justice system. We need to look at this all in the round. Looking at this in silos just simply doesn't work.
Let's just show everybody this story in Nancy's paper, covered recently in the Sheffield Star. It says Sheffield Council considers smoking ban on pavements outside cafes, pubs, bars and restaurants. You went back to your readers, Nancy, and asked them what they thought of the plan. What did they tell you?
It's very divisive, that's what they told us. I think smoking bans are always divisive. In fact, bans are always divisive, aren't they? But actually, there is more support for this than you might imagine. I also think that having myself, like many of our readers, been forced to sit outside pubs because of COVID restrictions, you suddenly realise how bad it is when you're surrounded by smoke, because naturally the smokers could smoke in the gardens, pub gardens, except we were all there suddenly. So actually, I think this is going to always get a reaction. The councils have already brought it in, has had a negative reaction, but overall, I think it's a good thing. We know smoking kills. People who smoke know smoking kills. That's for them to deal with.
Madeleine?
I couldn't disagree more. I think if you're going to, I think basically we need to come to some kind of truce here between the smokers and the non-smokers. One of us gets inside, the others get outside. No one gets to claim both inside and outside. You know, I'm a occasional smoker, and we've already been hounded out of pubs and bars. And now the non-smokers want to claim the pavement. I just think this is, you know, where exactly are we supposed to smoke? Sometimes when I look at proposals like this, I just wish that the public health officials would come out and be honest about the fact that they want to ban smoking altogether, and they won't be happy until they've done that. But they don't want to admit to that extreme proposition, so they fall back on complaints about the risks of secondhand smoking outside and so on. And I read some of the comments of Nancy's readers, and some of them made very sensible remarks. A lot of them raised the fact that it's been a really terrible year for pubs already, and you'd think that they would be, the last thing they need right now is more prescriptive rules made by people who probably don't go to the pub all that often themselves.
Nancy?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots and lots of people who think this is a terrible idea. And yes, pubs need all the support that they can get. But it would be nice if smokers could support pubs without necessarily having to smoke something that is proven to cause cancer.
Right. I mean, Madeline, a recent YouGov poll has shown that only 19% of smokers think the government is going too far in trying to make them stop. There's no sign there of a hostility to sort of nanny state measures, is there?
That's interesting. That does surprise me, because I just think, how could anyone who smokes not think that the government has gone too far when the amount that we have to pay, for example, on taxes, there's this common myth that smokers are a drain on the NHS. It's the exact opposite is true, because we pay so much more for our cigarettes than people in many countries across Europe, that we're actually rather good for the exchequer, given how much we pay. I can only explain that as a sort of, perhaps there's institutionalised nanny statism that you learn to accept after living under it for so long. I must say that I don't see how any smoker can think that.
And before I bring the others in, just to answer Madeline's question, Nancy, where should smokers go for a cigarette if they? But
this isn't looking at banning smoking. This is looking at the areas immediately outside. So, for example,
but if you're at the pub, where should they go? Further down the street?
Well, maybe they could not smoke, or they could walk somewhere else. Yeah,
maybe you shouldn't smoke.
Give them smoking, perhaps.
Chris.
Or they could go for a walk around the block, which would combat the impact of the smoking, perhaps.
Madeline?
Why can't we just let the private venue decide what arrangements they make? I mean, if a pub, let's say that a pub decided that it wanted to have a private smoking room, if many of its clientele happened to be smokers, then in a way that would be good, because it would mean that the smokers would know there was a place they could go. We'd stay out of your way. We wouldn't be invading the smoke-free areas. But that's not allowed either. I mean, ultimately, what this is leading to is no one's allowed to smoke.
All right, before I go to you, Chris, because we can hear where you are on this, whose side are you on, Miriam?
Well, I think for a very short-term period, when pubs are only allowed to operate outdoors, I think there's an argument for a ban. But if you take any of these decisions on their own, you can argue, oh, well, this is safer, you know, there's an argument for this. But if you take these decisions in the round, banning things removes our autonomy as people, and that's wrong. I think there are cases where things should be banned because they're so harmful, but we all make decisions every day that are good for our health, that are bad for our health. That's part of being human, and I don't think it's a good position to be in, where we're relying on the state to tell us what is a good and bad decision to make. That removes our autonomy as people.
Chris?
I represent a former mining constituency, and you would think that lots of people in the Rhondda had died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease because of working in the mines. I asked the statistics, and it's almost twice as many died of COPD from smoking as died from the mines. So the thing I am proudest of as an MP was voting for the ban on smoking indoors, and including not allowing specialist rooms and specialist clubs and all the rest of it, because I probably saved more lives by that single vote than anything else I've done as an MP.
And what about outside?
I don't know.
You don't know. Miriam, in response to Chris's first point.
Well, I think that is a case in point. Taken on its own, the ban in smoking indoors, you know, you can see loads of positives from that. And I'm not a smoker myself. I've never smoked. I think it's a waste of money and it's bad for your health. I would never do it. But
I bet you, if you'd been in Parliament, you'd have voted against it at the time, and you'd done all these kind of libertarian
I honestly
arguments.
don't know. No, I'm I'm
bet.
not a libertarian, and I think none of these are black and white issues, and they should all be taken in the round. The same with COVID. I'm not a libertarian. I think we have to balance people's right to autonomy with the common good. I very strongly believe that. But when you take these decisions together and you move towards a situation where the state tells us what is good and bad, I mean, are we going to ban driving? What else are we going to ban? That is the overall picture that worries me.
On the whole, I don't like banning things. I'm a gay man. We were banned for centuries, so I quite like the fact that we're allowed to exist now.
Madeline, Madeline, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, I think that there's also a general, the direction of travel is almost in changing the way that we as autonomous adults are allowed to behave. There are serious proposals amongst many MPs in Parliament, I think, are supporting the idea of bringing the smoking age up to 21, even though the voting age is at 16. Is at 18, and there are many MPs that would like to see it lowered to 16. You know, I think
it is in Wales.
Yes, well, exactly, but that there needs to be a fundamental conversation about what is adulthood if the state bans you from doing something at 21, but other very important, serious obligations are permitted at a younger age. It's all very confusing.
Just going to briefly go into the chamber because Prime Minister's Questions is going to be up in a few minutes' time. It was a bit late, actually, last week. But before we go to PMQs, Chris, you have referred yourself to the committee of which you are chair for not declaring a trip. Just tell us what's going on.
So I went to Poland in 2019 as a guest of the British Council to address a future leaders conference, and it cost £600 or £606 and 35p or something like that, and I should have declared it, and I completely forgot, and I don't know why I forgot it. I have absolutely no excuse whatsoever. I've thrown myself on the mercy of the Parliamentary Commission, well, not of myself, no, of the Parliamentary Commission for Standards. But we have a system which we use pretty regularly where the Commissioner can simply rectify. I think Raymond Chishti was in a similar situation last week with about 25 MPs last year. We do it every second week. Our rules are too complicated, but frankly, I'm just an idiot because I forgot. Right. I have no excuse whatsoever, and I'm just glad that we have a system where if you do fess up, you get absolution. Right. Does he get absolution?
I completely commend Chris for his honesty and transparency, and I think it's a good thing to have high standards in public life. And if you do that, you've also got to have a high level of forgiveness because we mess up, we make mistakes, and usually there's no malice or intent in it. We're just human. Right. What is the process then? How long will it take before we...
It's done.
Oh, it's all done.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
I mean, I think there was another case a couple of years ago where it was very similar. Somebody had completely forgotten to register something. It was sorted in 5 hours. So all I'd say to members is if the Commissioner gets in touch about something, reply very quickly because it'll all be done and dusted in 24 hours.
Right, I think we might just have time for this quickly. Camilla Tominey in The Telegraph has just tweeted this. The Queen will host Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, at Windsor Castle on Friday. #Orcs, awkward, #England. Madeline?
Yeah, it's good. I think the Queen is so diplomatic. I can't imagine Angela Merkel coming into the room and the Queen's like, hey, England. But,
to be fair, the Queen has a little bit of royal German blood in her.
Yeah,
so, I mean, I think it's not going to be a knees up, though, is it?
Well, I don't know. Be good to be in the room, wouldn't it, at the time to see?
I don't think you're going to get invited.
No, I don't think I am. Nancy?
Yeah, I don't think that will be an awkward meeting. There's more awkward marriages in Sheffield with divided opinion over football. I can show you the Queen can get through this.
Miriam, what do you think? Would you like to be there as that goes on? Because Angela Merkel does like her football.
I think it'd be very interesting, but I would hope the Queen, as the Queen of the United Kingdom, would also be commiserating with Wales and Scotland as well as celebrating with England.
Right, well, I think
Very good point.
What is a very good point? Oh, we're still not at Prime Minister's Questions, so we will have to talk about Friday. I'm sorry, we will have to talk about the football now we've done you as well. But are you going to be watching on Saturday?
What? There's another round, isn't there?
Yes, Chris.
Sorry, look, I hated that thing of Boris earlier, sort of pretending that he knew whether somebody scored or not.
Yeah, but you can't.
I mean, I'm not going to fake that I'm interested in football because I'm not.
No,
I'm sorry. I'm delighted for England. Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!
Right, Madeline, will you be watching? I know you're not a fan either.
Oh yeah, I'll probably go and catch it at the pub. I mean, I would never claim to know anything about it, but I think that even those of us who are complete Philistines on football, you do get that fear of missing out, the FOMO feeling.
Well,
I think I'm just a sheep, really.
Well, you said it.
I was in Argentina when Argentina won the World Cup in 1986, and that was, I remember feeling the whole of the country kind of breathe in and then scream for about 24 hours.
What about the historic rivalry? Do you think that's been put to bed, Nancy, between Germany and England?
No, you can't put that to bed. I mean, we've got the upper hand now, but it's not been put to bed, has it? That comes back every single match. But there were pubs in Sheffield full of football fans at 7:30 in the morning yesterday. We're heading into a weekend. The celebrations are going to start way before the day actually comes.
Right, hold it.
We're going to love it.
Hold that thought, because Prime Minister's Questions is here.
And thank him for all his service to this House and wish him all the very best in his retirement. Mr. Speaker, I know members from across this House will want to congratulate Gareth Southgate and his team on their 2-0 win against Germany at Wembley last night, the first time the men's team have beaten Germany in 55 years in a knockout game. We wish them all the best for their match against Ukraine on Saturday, and we'll all be hoping against hope that this time finally, football is coming home. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Catherine Fletcher.
Mr. Speaker, after yesterday's game, many of our German friends are heading home. But does my right honourable friend agree that, as the song goes, if they want to stay here, drinking all our beer, then they need to join the 5.6 million people who have already successfully applied for the EUSS settlement scheme forthwith before today's deadline?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, and she is absolutely right. I am thrilled that an astonishing 5.6 million EU nationals have already applied for this wonderful scheme, and I encourage anybody who is still eligible to submit their applications today.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join your comments and sentiments about Ian Davis and wish him the very best from all of us in this House? Can I also congratulate the England team for yesterday's performance? Having been at Wembley for the Euro 96 semi-final and experienced firsthand the agony of that defeat, yesterday's result was truly incredible. And I know the whole House will wish the team the very best of luck on Saturday. The whole House will wish them the best of luck on Saturday, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, why didn't the Prime Minister sack the former Health Secretary on Friday morning?
Mr. Speaker, I read the story in common with you and everybody else on Friday, and we had a new health secretary in place by Saturday, Mr. Speaker, which I think, given that we have a pandemic, I think to move from one health secretary to the next with that speed was fast, Mr. Speaker, but it wasn't as fast as the vaccine rollout, Mr. Speaker, which is now going so fast that we've done in this week half of the under 30s, Mr. Speaker, have now had their first jab, and that is speed.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, what a ridiculous answer. The Prime Minister must have been the only person in the country who looked at that photo on Friday morning and thought that the Health Secretary shouldn't be sacked immediately. On Friday, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said, quote, "The Prime Minister considers the matter closed." Minister after minister were then sent out to defend the indefensible. It was briefed that the Prime Minister was quite happy for the Health Secretary to stay in his post. So, can the Prime Minister clarify, now he's got the chance, did he sack the Health Secretary or at any point ask him to resign? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman will notice that the Health Secretary has changed in the last 5 days. He complains about the speed with which that happened. This government moved at positively lightning speed by comparison to the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite, who spent 3 days trying and failing to sack his deputy leader, Mr. Speaker, who he then promoted, Mr. Speaker. He fires and rehires.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Leader is sitting beside me. The former Health Secretary The former Health Secretary has done a runner. Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the Prime Minister said the case was closed. Then on Monday, he tried to take the credit for the Health Secretary's resigning. In a minute, he'll be telling us he scored the winner last night. But let me press the Prime Minister a bit more on this. The person the Health Secretary was in a relationship with was his non-executive director. Let me remind the House, according to the government's own guidance, one of the roles of a non-executive director is to challenge the Secretary of State and the department, to challenge them. And they receive taxpayers' money for doing so. So from the offset, it was blindingly obvious that there was a conflict of interest here and a whole host of unanswered questions. Why on earth did the Prime Minister judge that this matter was closed on Friday morning?
Mr. Speaker, I hesitate to accuse the right honourable gentleman of repeating his question. I observe that the non-executive director in question is also no longer with the department. And what the continuity, Mr. Speaker, is that that department is getting on with the fastest vaccine rollout of any European country. And I'm proud to tell this House that this week, I can tell you what's happened just in the last few days. This country has actually overtaken Israel in the proportion of people we have vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And I think he might pay tribute to the Health Department for that achievement.
Yes, Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me get this right. The Prime Minister was happy to keep a Health Secretary in place during the pandemic who he not only thought was absolutely hopeless, but he also knew had broken the rules and was in a relationship with somebody he was employing at taxpayers' expense. It doesn't sound like case closed to me. And I know the Prime Minister is keen to sweep this under the carpet. But let me tell the Prime Minister why this matters. Millions of people made huge and very difficult sacrifices to follow the rules that his Health Secretary had introduced. Prime Minister, take the case of Ollie Beebe. I'm sorry, you might want to listen. Ollie died of leukemia on the 5th of May, the day before the photo of the former Health Secretary was taken. Ollie died, like so many other people in this pandemic, with his family and friends unable to spend time with him. When he was in hospital, he begged to see his family. But following the rules, only one member of his family was allowed to see him. His mum said, "I'm livid. We did everything we were told to do. And the man who made the rules didn't. How can that be right?" So I asked the Prime Minister again, how could he possibly think this matter was closed on Friday morning?
Mr. Speaker, we all share the grief and the pain of Ollie and his family and millions of people up and down the country who have endured the privations that this country has been through in order to get the coronavirus pandemic under control. And that is why we had a change of Health Secretary the day after the story appeared, Mr. Speaker. And that is why, actually, what we are doing as a government, instead of focusing on stuff going on within the Westminster bubble, we are focusing on rolling out that vaccine, those vaccines at a rate that will make sure that people like Ollie and his family do not have to suffer in the future. And I'm proud to say, as a result of the efforts made by the NHS, by the Department of Health, by July the 19th, we will have vaccinated everybody. Every adult over 18 will have received one jab, and everybody over 40 will have received 2 jabs, Mr. Speaker. That is the priority of this government, and quite right too.
Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I can hardly think that the Prime Minister thinks it's appropriate in response to a question about Ollie to suggest that this is, in his words, the Westminster bubble. The Westminster bubble in answer to that question, Prime Minister? Before Prime Minister's questions this morning, I spoke to Ollie's mum about the awful circumstances that she and her family have been through. She told me, Prime Minister, that every day she watched the press conferences, every day they were on, and she hung on to every word that government ministers said, so that she would know what her family could and couldn't do. Yeah. And then they followed the rules. Yeah. This is not the Westminster bubble. Yeah. She told me that for her and her family, this case isn't closed. Yeah. And she speaks for millions of people. Yeah. Ask the Prime Minister to withdraw that when he gets up. Yeah. withdraw that when he gets up. It's the wrong response to Ollie's case. I can't help concluding that the Prime Minister didn't ask relevant questions on Friday morning, either because he didn't want to know the answers, or because he knows full well there's more to come out. Well, then, he says nonsense. So I asked the Prime Minister, in response to his muttered nonsense, when he declared the case closed on Friday morning, had he asked the Health Secretary if he'd broken any other rules? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear with the right honourable gentleman, and I think the whole House and the whole country can see that we have a new Health Secretary in place, and have had one since the day after the stories appeared, and that was entirely right, and that was the right response to the situation, and he is, of course, he's right in what he says about the sacrifice made by families up and down the land. But the best response, in my view, to their grief and their pain and the sufferings that they have endured is to get on with a new Health Secretary, which is what we have, and with all the energy and application that we have, to roll out those vaccines and allow the people of this country to work forwards towards Freedom Day, which I devoutly hope will come on July the 19th. And never let it be forgotten, Mr. Speaker, that if we'd followed the advice of the right honourable gentleman, that would not be possible, because it was under his proposals that we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency and been unable to deliver the vaccine rollout at all.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I really think that having failed to sack the former Health Secretary, he really is trying to take credit now for the fact that we've got a new Health Secretary. So, Mr. Speaker, well, it wouldn't be there if the Prime Minister had his way. The matter was closed. So, Mr. Speaker, it's no questions asked by the Prime Minister on Friday and no questions answered today. There's a pattern here. When Dominic Cummings broke the rules by driving to Barnard Castle, the Prime Minister backed him. When the Housing Secretary unlawfully approved a £1 billion property deal for a Tory donor, the Prime Minister backed him. When the Home Secretary broke the ministerial code, the Prime Minister backed her. And when the Health Secretary broke COVID rules, the Prime Minister tried and wanted to back him too. Every time it's the same old story. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that while the British people are doing everything asked of them, it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else?
Mr. Speaker, there was a new Health Secretary the following day, Mr. Speaker, and the whole country can see that, and we are getting on with our agenda of vaccinating the population of this country through the energy and application of the new Secretary of State for Health and the Department of Health. And I thank them and I congratulate them. And it's as a result of that vaccine rollout, Mr. Speaker, which, as I say, would have been impeded, fatally impeded, had we followed the policies of the party opposite. That we're able now we have a higher wall of vaccination than virtually any other country in the world, and we are able to proceed with our cautious but we hope irreversible unlocking of the UK economy, with the result, Mr. Speaker, that growth is up to levels we haven't seen since last July. Jobs are up, and he calls for us to act faster in removing cabinet ministers, Mr. Speaker. It took him 3 days, as I say, to give her three new jobs. Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work. We create jobs, Mr. Speaker. He creates non-jobs. He dithers, we deliver.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The steel industry is an asset of national strategic importance. Not just my words, but the words of the Prime Minister. And I know he means it, because when Grable went into administration, this government supported British Steel until a new buyer was found. British Steel still employ more than 800 people in Redcar and Cleveland and more than 3,000 people in Scunthorpe. So can I ask the Prime Minister, in light of the TRA's recommendations to the Trade Secretary, how will he ensure that steel remains a national strategic asset?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to campaign for British Steel, and we have an ambitious plan to transform our country with better use of British Steel. As I said to the House a couple of weeks ago, there's a 7.6 million pipeline of steel waiting to be waiting to be bought over the next decade. And as for the recommendations of the Trade Remedies Authority. The government is considering them, and the Department for International Trade will update the House later today.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I join you in wishing Ian Davis all the best for his retirement and thank him for the service that he's given to the Scots Guards in this House. He has truly been a friend and a sane voice to give guidance to those of us on these benches when we've needed it, and I thank him very much for that. Can I congratulate England for their victory last night, and of course wish them all the best in the tournament ahead. Of course, they've done well. They've won most of their matches, with the exception of the game against Scotland, where, of course, they even failed to score a goal. No luck. Mr. Speaker, in July 2019, this Prime Minister gave an unequivocal guarantee to EU nationals living in the UK. The Prime Minister said they will have an absolute certainty for the right to live and remain. Less than 2 years later, hundreds of thousands of EU nationals have been left in limbo, including thousands of children. While the settlement scheme deadline falls today, we know there are hundreds of thousands of unprocessed cases. It is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, that their rights will be diminished by their failures of this government. Will the Prime Minister honour his word, give certainty, scrap the disastrous settled status deadline before we face another Tory Windrush?
I thank the right honourable gentleman, and I'm just to repeat what I said to my honourable friend earlier. I think it's fantastic that 5.6 million people have applied. We are processing all the applications as fast as we possibly can, and clearly the most important thing is for anybody who still hasn't applied to get their application in today.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But the issue is there is a backlog of hundreds of thousands of cases because of delays on decisions. Mr. Speaker, overnight, thousands of our friends and neighbours could become illegal immigrants. They are living in fears for their jobs, their families and their livelihoods, all because this Prime Minister won't keep his word. We know all too well the experience of this government's Home Office. Dawn raids, vulnerable people deported, a hostile environment for the Windrush generation. Scotland's message to EU citizens is you're welcome here. We want you to stay. This is your home. But this UK government is causing EU citizens untold stress. One woman who has been in the UK for 44 years says that she feels suicidal. Another says she feels like a third-rate citizen. So, Mr. Speaker, this is shameful. Will the government now do the right thing? Scrap the deadline and introduce automatically granted settled status? Or will the Prime Minister's legacy be the ridiculous removal of NHS staff, our local community workers, our teachers and many more who have made their homes here?
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious from the statistics I've already quoted that this is an outstanding success, because we've had huge numbers of people applying. And of course, if there are people still who have to apply, and there's been several extensions of the deadline. It's 5 years now since the Brexit referendum. We've funded 72 organisations to help vulnerable EU citizens to understand what their rights are, to make the applications. Anybody applying within the deadline will, of course, have their case dealt with, and I urge them to get on with it.
Let's go to Henry Smith. Henry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute to the government for the world-leading COVID-19 vaccination programme. And can I encourage my right honourable friend and the government to press ahead with allowing those who are fully vaccinated greater international travel to save as many aviation and travel sector jobs as possible and help regrow our economy?
I thank my honourable friend, and I congratulate him on his long-standing campaign for the justified campaign for the aviation sector, and that's why we've invested £7 billion already to support aviation since the start of the pandemic. But obviously, what we hope is that the vaccine rollout programme, the double jabs programme, will enable people to start flying and really give that industry the prospect of a long-term sustainable recovery.
Let's go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Environmental Audit Committee, of which I'm a member, has published a report calling for transformational change in the government's approach to restoring nature. And it's not just about the 15% of UK species that are threatened with extinction, the cuckoos, the kittiwakes, the turtle doves, but the ebbing away of so much of our natural world. The Conservative chair of our committee says that government policies too often remain, and I quote, grandiose statements lacking teeth and devoid of effective delivery mechanisms. So I want to ask the Prime Minister something very specific. Will he look again at the government amendment to the Environment Bill that refers only to measures to further the objective of halting species decline, rather than actually meeting that objective? A one-word change from furthering to meeting would make a world of difference by introducing the legally binding target to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 that his government has promised. So will he do it? Will he make that change? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed not just to halting, but to reversing biodiversity loss, not just in this country, but around the world. And she can see that from the conclusions of the G7 summit and everything that the government does to promote biodiversity across our country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last few years, we've seen the proliferation of hate speech, harmful content, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories on social media. In response, the government has published its world-leading draft online safety bill. Can the Prime Minister say when Parliament will be given the opportunity to start the scrutiny of that draft bill?
Prime Minister.
The bill has been published in draft form, and a pre-legislative scrutiny will start as soon as a joint committee has been established. And I'm given to understand from my right honourable friend, the Chief Whip, that my right honourable friend may be in a position to serve with advantage in the scrutiny of that bill.
Catherine McKinnon.
Thank you. We all know that great sport starts at the grassroots, whether that's football or swimming, and we all need help and encouragement to live healthier lives post-pandemic. Yet since last March, over 400 leisure and fitness facilities have permanently closed, including our much-loved swimming pool in West Denton, and many thousands more are under threat. So will the Prime Minister do two things about that today? Expand and extend the National Leisure Recovery Fund to fund these much-needed facilities, and back Newcastle's bid for the Outer West Leisure Centre from the Levelling Up Fund. Everybody deserves a chance to live a healthier life and one day perhaps to play or swim for their country.
Well, I thank the honourable lady, because I think that it was a great question, and she's absolutely right to champion grassroots sport and what it can do for young people and for the health of this country. I certainly hope that the centre she champions will be successful in the Levelling Up Fund, but obviously I can't control that myself. She must make that case herself. But I'm wishing her every possible good fortune.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Rochester, we are incredibly proud of our long-standing creative arts community and the contribution it makes to the Medway towns. So it has come as a huge blow that the Board of Directors at the University of Creative Arts have decided to close the Rochester campus after its 135-year history in the town, having inspired some of our most successful artists and designers, such as Dame Zandra Rhodes, Karen Millen and Tracy Emin. Does my right honourable friend agree that the university's plan to close the site at such a difficult time for the sector will be detrimental to our levelling up agenda locally, but also to the opportunities for so many working class kids in Medway, for who this campus has always provided an instrumental route into further and higher education?
I thank my honourable friend. She's right to campaign for higher education, particularly in her constituency, and I know that she's been engaged with university leaders on the ground in Rochester, and I'm sure that they will have listened carefully to what she has to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited David McCutcheon, the Chief Executive of Bullet Express, which is a haulage firm in the Baillieston area of my constituency. Everybody in this House knows that there have been huge problems with a shortage of HGV drivers in this country, and that's only been compounded further by Brexit. So I've got a simple question for the Prime Minister. Why can't we add HGV drivers to the UK shortage occupation list?
Mr. Speaker, I'll certainly look at what he's proposing, but I think the most important thing is to get our entire workforce back at work. And there are currently millions of people still on furlough, and of course there are labour shortages at the moment, but we need to get people back into work, and that's why we've got to continue to roll out the vaccines in the way that we are.
Let's go to Sir Gurry Street. Gurry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that the counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset and Dorset have come together to form the Great South West to generate regional growth and prosperity in much the same way as the Midland Engine and the Northern Powerhouse. It has the support of all local authorities, LEPs and the business community, but we've now been waiting for recognition from government for well over 3 years, and frustration, Mr. Speaker, is reaching fever pitch. Can my right honourable friend please look into this matter and give us the green light so we can help the government achieve its objectives of sustainable growth, prosperity and jobs?
Mr. Speaker, I'm a passionate supporter of the Greater South West and the prospects that it brings. But I understand also that my right honourable friend has met the Minister for Regional Growth and Local Government to discuss these proposals, and I look forward to hearing their outcome.
Let's go to Christina Rees. Christina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents have been angered by the treatment of DVLA staff and the disgraceful harassment of PCS Union Rep Sarah Evans. With cases rising significantly in South Wales in the third wave of the pandemic, why does the Prime Minister feel it is so acceptable for the DVLA to have returned over 450 staff to their Swansea site, contrary to government advice, as some of them can and have been working effectively and safely from home?
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, rates of infection and disease have been declining at the DVLA site, and I hope very much that everybody there can return to work in the normal way as soon as possible.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, the High Street's had a bit of a difficult time lately, and Gedlings have been no exception. But Gedling Borough Council's Levelling Up Fund bid will help to kickstart High Street regeneration, improve Arnold Town Centre, and encourage healthy travel in Netherfield. So will my right honourable friend join me in thanking the council officers at Gedling Borough Council, particularly Mike Hill and Joel Davis, who have put the bid together? And will he agree with me that this is a bid that can help to make Gedling an even better place to live, work and raise a family?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Mike Hill and Joel Davis for their efforts, and that's exactly, and I thank them also for what they're doing to call upon the Levelling Up Fund, which will indeed invest in infrastructure projects that improves life across the country, but in his constituency particularly.
Let's go to Dr. Philippa Whitford. Philippa.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Due to his failure to maintain strict border quarantine and delay in adding India to the red list, cases of the Delta variant are surging across the UK. As well as a marked regional variation, the biggest ongoing impact is on sectors such as hospitality, entertainment and aviation. So rather than starting to reduce financial support from tomorrow, will the Prime Minister agree to extend full furlough and business support beyond September, particularly for those geographical areas and businesses which are most affected?
No, Mr. Speaker, because although the Delta variant is indeed seeded and growing in at least 74 countries around the world, including this one, this is the only country, or the country where the protection by immunity against the Delta variant is the highest and the strongest. And that's why we're going to continue with our cautious but irreversible roadmap, and I hope that it will command her support.
Let's go to Peter Gibson. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for all that he is doing to level up our country? A rising tide must float all ships. And to that end, will he commit to delivering the Northern Link Road for Darlington? And will he further commit to helping stop LNER's great train robbery of services from our station? And finally, does my right honourable friend agree with me that our levelling up agenda, investing in the North, should provide the people of Backley and Spen with great confidence as they go to the polls?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and it tells you all you need to know about the modern Labour Party, that when they heard that there was going to be an economic campus in Darlington, they called it giving up, Mr. Speaker. That's what the right honourable gentleman said, and he's totally right, by the way, to support Ryan Stevenson in his campaign for Batley and Spen tomorrow. I believe that Ryan will offer a strong local voice for change and progress in Batley and Spen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister is delighted that the High Court in Belfast this morning upheld the government's view on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And later today, we're also expecting a joint EU-UK agreement in relation to extension of the grace period around chilled meats. So, does the Prime Minister accept that today may well be a watershed, where we can stop talking about the protocol in constitutional and identity terms, but rather the UK and EU jointly work through the genuine problems to find pragmatic solutions? And in doing so, can the Prime Minister also call for calm in Northern Ireland ahead of the marching season?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and the best thing that the EU can do is to make sure that we remove all the problems that are currently associated with their application of the protocol, the ban on chilled meats, the restriction on the circulation of cancer drugs, the fact that 20% of all the customs checks carried out around the whole of the EU are carried out in Northern Ireland, and I hope that all that can be fixed indeed, Mr. Speaker, and then we can move on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I was in Batley and Spen campaigning with our fantastic candidate Ryan Stevenson. He is committed to delivering the police that we need on our streets. So from Brixham to Salcombe, Batley and Spen, will the Prime Minister commit to supporting initiatives like the Councillor Advocate Scheme that was launched by my Police and Crime Commissioner, Alison Hernandez?
Yes, I'm a big fan of Alison Hernandez, Mr. Speaker, and I think she's doing absolutely the right thing. And to support her, we are, of course, increasing policing presence on the streets of the city. We're rolling up county lines drugs gangs, about a third of them that we've tackled so far. And we've also instituted tougher penalties for serious sexual and violent offenders, Mr. Speaker, which were opposed on a three-line whip by the party opposite.
Bill Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're experiencing a knife crime epidemic in London. As much as 50 people have been killed by knife crime in our city, with a staggering 17 of these being young people and one of my own young constituents. I fear that we are going to see more and more people, young people in particular, needlessly lose their lives, and with the summer approaching, more and more violence on our streets. The Prime Minister is aware just how much youth services are important in the prevention of crime. So could he explain why his government has cut over 70% of youth services in the past decade? And will he pledge to do more for this city's young people, put his money where his mouth is, and reverse these disastrous cuts?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we invested in youth services and we'll continue to do so. But I think it's quite extraordinary that she continues to avoid the McCavity-like performance of the Mayor of London, who's totally failing to grip this, to reduce serious crime and to stop knife crime. There was a previous Mayor of London, Mr. Speaker, who got the murder rate down by 50% because we gripped it and we took responsibility in City Hall. I think it's shocking to see what Sadiq Khan is doing on this issue, but we will do everything we can to fill in the gap.
Ian Paisley, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I refer to my registered interests and also associate all Northern Ireland members with the tribute you have made to Ian Davies today. Prime Minister, today the Belfast High Court has actually found that the protocol does conflict with the Act of Union, though it does not break the law. That it has repealed aspects of the Act of Union which is in direct contravention to the commitments that this government has actually made to the people of this kingdom. The Prime Minister will be aware that litigation is still ongoing in the High Court in England on a commercial case that could result in the loss of earnings claim of hundreds of millions of pounds by British businesses trading in Northern Ireland. Under Section 8 of the Withdrawal Agreement, the Parliament here is sovereign. The judgment today confirms that Parliament is sovereign. Prime Minister, you have a solid majority on your benches? Have you the will to now finish this job, to reverse the mistakes of the Northern Ireland Protocol, to seize the moment and to defend the Union and to unilaterally fix once and for all and put Northern Ireland out of its commercial, social and political misery?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman. We will, of course, study the ruling of the court in detail, but I can give him this general assurance, which he knows to be true, that nothing will affect the position of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, and we will make sure that we uphold that.
I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business.
That's it for this week's Prime Minister's Questions. Boris Johnson answering that final question from Ian Paisley about the result and the judgment of a court case that was just publicised before Prime Minister's Questions, and we brought to you on Politics Live that a group of unionists, in fact, lost their case in terms of challenging the Northern Ireland Protocol as being unlawful. And if we get any more reaction to that, we will bring it to you. But let me introduce our guest for this part of the programme. Rachel Maclean, Government Transport Minister, welcome to you. Peter Kyle, Shadow Education Minister, and here in the studio with me, Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, Vicky, went on the attack over what he said was the Prime Minister's judgment and failing to sack his former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, immediately when that video emerged last week, at the end of last week, of him kissing his aide. How successful was he?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's several strands to this, aren't there? There's the rule breaking itself, which Matt Hancock did admit to. He resigned, of course. Then there's the apparent conflict of interest, the fact that his aide, Gina Coladangelo, was a non-executive director at the Department of Health on the board there. Now, their job is to hold the department to account.
To scrutinise.
So how can that happen if she's in a either friendship or relationship with the Health Secretary? So there's various strands to all of this. And I think Keir Starmer trying to say that this isn't over just because Matt Hancock has resigned. And as you say, trying to pin this on the Prime Minister and his judgment. And I have to say that talking to some Tory MPs and ministers, there has been a question raised about that. You know, what do people need to do to get fired by the Prime Minister in all of this? And people look at a pattern, whether it goes back to Priti Patel, Robert Jenrick, all of those mentioned there by Keir Starmer. And interesting, one minister saying to me, you know, what they don't want is to get to this position where voters might start looking, and he felt this is like a party that maybe has slipped its moorings when it comes to standards in public life. And for that to get out there, and if the public start to think that, that could end up being damaging to the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister's response to all of this, basically to talk about vaccines.
Indeed. Keir Starmer then raised the very tragic case of a young man, Ollie, who had been in hospital for a number of weeks, 7 weeks or so, and then eventually died of leukemia. What was he saying to the Prime Minister?
Yeah, and he said he'd spoken to the parents about this. And if you read the story, BBC Essex has spoken to the family as well. And it's like, unfortunately, so many awful stories that we've read over the last year and a half of people denied access to their loved ones when they are sick and, in this case, dying. Now, Ollie was in hospital for 7 weeks. I think some will say that the hospital themselves, it was UCLH in London, they said they were following the rules. The family obviously felt there should have been more discretion on the visits he was allowed. 1 a week from one person. Eventually, he was allowed 2. But it's really difficult stuff to read, a terrible thing for the family. And then, of course, the fact that the Prime Minister, in part of his answer, while sympathising with the family, also talked about Keir Starmer shouldn't focus on the Westminster bubble. And I think that didn't go down too well at all.
Well, Rachel, in that reference, his comment, the Prime Minister, to a Westminster bubble or a Westminster bubble story, should he have retracted it?
No, I think the Prime Minister was right to focus on the overall objective of getting vaccines rolled out to protect more people. But look, you know, this is, of course, it's a horrible awful story, and our hearts go out to the family, and we've all heard of these similar cases. Of course, I hear them from my own constituents and from my own family. But the Prime Minister ultimately has replaced the Health Secretary with a new Health Secretary. It's very important that we carry on with the work of protecting our population.
Right, but was it right to, in many people's minds, dismiss that story as Westminster bubble, or the Labour leader focusing on it as Westminster bubble? Would your constituents understand that?
I don't think the Prime Minister did do that. Actually, what the Prime Minister said was that he deeply sympathised with the family, which of course he does, and he's met many families throughout this pandemic. But in terms of the sort of gossip and scandal surrounding who is in the cabinet or not, that absolutely is a Westminster bubble story. But we have to separate that from the really important work that matters to our constituents, which is delivering the vaccine and saving lives.
You say that is a Westminster bubble. What is precisely? I mean, the Health Secretary, the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has himself admitted he broke the rules. Is that not a matter of concern?
Of course it is. Right. And it's a matter of huge concern. And he has rightly resigned and left the government, and we have a new Health Secretary. It's absolutely right that all ministers do uphold the high standards, and he was right to resign.
Right. Well, if they are supposed to uphold high standards, why didn't the Prime Minister sack him the minute that video emerged of him breaking those rules by kissing his top aide?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has answered that in his own words today and been very clear.
Right. By saying it's a Westminster bubble.
I think you're slightly misinterpreting what was said. There has to be investigations into something that appears in the media in order to understand, where the source of that, and people have to be given a chance to put their side of the story. And as soon as that happened, my understanding is that we had a new Health Secretary. Ultimately, it is up to the Prime Minister who serves in his cabinet, but we need to get on with the job of having a new Health Secretary in place. Sajid Javid is a fantastic Health Secretary and he's already hit the ground running, has been to the Commons and is carrying on with delivering the vaccine programmes and getting our NHS back on its feet.
Right. I mean, but Keir Starmer is right. Boris Johnson didn't sack Matt Hancock, did he, his former Health Secretary? Why not?
Well, ultimately, the Prime Minister himself makes those decisions.
But he didn't. He didn't sack him.
He decides who serves in his cabinet, and the Health Secretary resigned, and he was right to do that.
Peter Carr, do you accept some of what Rachel says in terms of the public will think the matter now is closed?
I think what Keir Starmer did today was he exposed two flaws. The first is Boris Johnson's competence to run the country. He's not running his government. I mean, he wanted Matt Hancock to stay. He went the next day under pressure from the opposition and the media. And secondly, it is about the people in government. When Keir moved throughout the questioning towards other cabinet ministers, he made the point very well. This is a pattern. There are ministers throughout government in the cabinet who are making rules for other people that do not apply to them. It is a really important point. Take Priti Patel. An independent inquiry found that she had established a culture of bullying, that she was herself a bully. Nobody who is working in the private sector up and down the country could get away with the behaviour she does in their jobs. So it is a problem that we have throughout our government. People just don't think the rules that they are making for other people apply to them. And I think Keir did that really well today.
Right. Rachel, do you agree? One rule for ministers and one rule for the rest of us?
No, I completely disagree. I'm a minister in the government and I take my responsibility incredibly seriously. And all ministers who serve in this government are expected to and do follow very stringent
Rachel,
procedures.
have you been found guilty of bullying by an independent inquiry? And if you had, would you resign?
I'm not going to get into this sort of wild speculation, Peter.
It's not speculation. It's an independent inquiry. An independent inquiry found her to be a bully and creating a bullying culture in her department. It's not gossip. It happened. And she decided not to resign, and the Prime Minister didn't sack her. That is not applying the rules to yourself that other people have to apply to themselves.
Rachel?
In their jobs.
You asked me what I would do, Peter, and that situation hasn't happened to me because my conduct is not in question. I am proud to serve in this government. I am proud to follow the very stringent rules that are set out for everyone that serves in the government.
Right. I mean, Keir Starmer, this was obviously from the Prime Minister, Peter Carr, tried to sack Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, after the Hartlepool by-election result, but didn't manage to either successfully.
Actually, we have no idea what happened in that period. But what we do know is that we've got a team which is rooted in the future, which is working flat out, trying to get kids back into school, to try and get people back into jobs up and down the country, that is really trying to get our country fit for the challenges that we face ahead. I mean, there was no, that is 100% what we on the front bench and Keir is trying to do and the Labour Party is trying to achieve right now.
All right, we can go and speak to Kate Hoey. I said we may be able to talk to her earlier on in the programme, following on from the result of that court case. Kate, former Labour MP, now in the House of Lords as a non-affiliated peer. Kate, you were part of the group of unionists who brought this case to challenge the Northern Ireland Protocol. You must be disappointed. You've lost.
Well, it's the very first stage in what will be, I think, a very long, protracted battle. We obviously will be appealing this judgment. It's particularly important because of the ruling on the Act of Union, which, of course, the judge has said that it has been impliedly repealed. And, of course, the Prime Minister just a couple of weeks ago in Prime Minister's question said it hadn't. And this is huge repercussions, for not just Northern Ireland and the result of the protocol, but it really has repercussions for the whole of the United Kingdom and the Union. So it's going to be very important that we do appeal this and that people really wake up right throughout the United Kingdom and realise that if this can happen because of something that isn't even mentioned in Parliament as being anything to do with the Act of Union, what can happen at other times? So it really is important.
Right. Well, Kate, I don't know if you heard this, but in Prime Minister's questions at the end, Ian Paisley asked Boris Johnson about what he was going to do about the situation that you've outlined. And Boris Johnson said nothing will affect the position of Northern Ireland. Does that reassure you?
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. This is the thin end of a wedge, and it's also a drip thing that can happen. That gradually more and more Northern Ireland is being set apart from the rest of the United Kingdom. On our ballot paper for the EU leaving the EU, it said the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. We haven't left the European Union in Northern Ireland, and the protocol, which was designed for all sorts of supposedly good intentions, has now shown that it's actually constitutionally hugely important. And I just hope now that many people in the Conservative Party and Unionist Party, as they call themselves, will realise what has happened. And the Prime Minister has to now act quickly, because I'm afraid that this judgment today will be sending very, very strong signals to people in Northern Ireland that they have been abandoned, and they will not like that.
Right. Well, Rachel, you've been listening there to Kate Hoey. Is the government, is the Conservative and Unionist Party listening to Kate's concerns?
Yes, absolutely. And obviously this judgment itself will need to be studied. And I know that my colleague Lord Frost will be making a statement on some of these matters later this afternoon. But I think it is important to stress that this is just one of a number of issues that is causing disruption to businesses and citizens in Northern Ireland. But there are talks going on, as the Prime Minister said, and the intention is to very much honour the place of Northern Ireland within the Union. It is incredibly important that we do resolve these issues, as the Prime Minister said.
Right. I mean, Peter, you'll remember Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, I think it was in an interview or a call-in on LBC, agreeing with the government that checks on goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland are not the way forward. They shouldn't happen. How would that work?
Well, what we've always accepted is that outside of the European Union and outside of a customs union, there has to be a border somewhere. So the only way that we can go forward, I mean, Kate really, she's always failed all the way through this to say where she wants the border, because the whole purpose of Brexit, from her perspective, was to take back control. So you have to have a border somewhere. You can't take back control and have no borders. So what we do need to do going forward is come to an agreement with the European Union about how we can ensure that the integrity of the British market and the European Union market is upheld through some kind of processes within each territory.
All right. Well,
now, because there is so much acrimony in that relationship, it's very difficult to find how we can actually reassure each market that the integrity is being upheld.
All right, well, let me put that back to Kate. You failed to say where you would like a border, Kate.
Well, I've always said that, of course, the European Union needs to protect and wants to protect its internal market, and therefore the border between Northern Ireland and the independent country of the Republic of Ireland, who are left in the EU, clearly that has to be the EU's decision as to how they are going to protect their internal market. I mean, goods, the majority of goods are coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, are staying in Northern Ireland. Why should people in Northern Ireland, British citizens, suffer from the ridiculous situation where, you know, my relative wants to bring a pet dog over next week. They're going to have to get rabies injections and all of this kind of thing. We deserve equal citizenship. And what the protocol has done has taken away our rights to be British. And that is something that the government has to actually take on board, because tinkering about trade arrangements and stopping little bits of goods coming and saying, oh, well, we'll give you another, very kind of the EU today to come out and give us another 3 months grace period. How nice of them. You know, this should not be happening. And people who voted for the protocol didn't, I think many genuine Conservative members of Parliament did not realise just how dangerous this was. I think now, today, as a result of this court judgment, they will, and Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister is going to have to sort it out very, very quickly.
Kate Hoey, thank you very much for joining us there in the light of that court judgment. I'm just going to show our viewers this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Overseas bosses win exemption from quarantine rules. This is about the Department for Business telling executives at top companies that they'll no longer need to quarantine or stay in a hotel for 10 days when coming to the UK for important meetings from amber list countries because they want to ensure that the UK isn't disadvantaged. Your Deputy Leader, Peter, has said this was an offensive slap in the face for working people. Do you agree?
What I do agree is that it shows where the priorities of the government are. I mean, we've just been talking earlier in this programme and at PMQs about the family of Ollie who lost their son, but the family weren't allowed to even be with him. So government is putting all of its efforts into making sure that executives can get into the country, but they're putting no effort into making sure that the everyday lives of people who are really, really suffering by sticking by the rules at the moment, that their lives are changed. So I just think that we need to bring a bit more balance into this. It is right that we need to focus on our economy and how we open up, but we can't do so at the expense of the fairness that we take really seriously as part of our British values as a country. Is about fairness, and it just seems so starkly unfair that you can get these global executives flying in on private jets and they're exempt from the rules, and you get a family whose son is dying of leukemia that has to stick to them and they can't even be with him when he's dying.
Rachel?
I mean, this is really serious.
Rachel?
Well, I think Labour have to decide whether they want the economy to get back on its feet and whether they actually want to create more jobs for working people up and down the country. I mean, this is a government that's focused on levelling up. Levelling up starts when businesses can create jobs. And this particular policy is very tightly controlled. It's robust. There has to be genuine evidence that those people who are coming in are people such as, for example, the people that are going to be investing in new gigafactories to create batteries for our auto sector, to help us transition to electric vehicles on a global scale. This is the sort of thing that these people are going to be doing. This is about creating jobs for our country to help it get back on its feet. And I'm actually really surprised that Labour can't see that and are sort of falling back on this kind of class-based attack, which is completely inaccurate and wrong.
Peter?
Well, again, you're doing, Rachel, what Boris Johnson was doing there. I'm talking about a family that couldn't be together at the point where son died, and you're actually saying that that's class warfare. I think this is about basic humanity. And secondly, I won't be lectured about opening up the economy by the party that refused to seal our borders and allow the Delta variant to come in and rip through our education system, rip through our economy, and make sure that all of the freedom date that you've been talking about has been delayed by weeks and weeks. If you'd done what Labour asked you to do back in April, the economy would be fully open now. The economy is only 3/4 shut because of your bad decision-making of your government. So I'll take no lectures about getting workers back to work and students back to studying.
Rachel?
Again, I'm afraid that's complete nonsense. I've been very clear that obviously the case of Ollie is tragic, but that's got absolutely nothing to do with opening up the economy and getting businesses able to invest for the future. We've all seen some of those sectors that have struggled. And on the one hand, Labour are calling for more support, more money from the public purse. We want those businesses to open up and to start creating jobs. And actually, this sort of narrative about the Delta variant is completely inaccurate. We had India on the red list 2 full weeks before that particular variant became a variant of concern. concern. And even before then, we had incredibly robust border measures, which were stricter than many other countries. So I think Peter's constructing a very convenient narrative with the benefit of some kind of hindsight, but it doesn't. The facts don't bear it out at all. And in fact, our progress now, because of our world-leading vaccination programme, which is way ahead of many other nations, is enabling us to get travel back on its feet.
Peter,
so why
briefly?
are 375,000 students not in school? Why is 3/4 of the economy not working right now and open? You know, why is it people can't travel? You know, these are reasons. Now, you've been talking about the Westminster bubble a bit earlier, but now you're entirely stuck in it. If you get out of the Westminster bubble and see that people who are working in the airline industry will get to work, people in the events industry can't get to work, students can't get to school, it is because the Delta variant has been brought into our country and it is ripping through our economy and our education system. It is in 70 countries, but 3/4 of the countries around the world don't have it in because they've been well managed.
All right, I'm going to interrupt there because I want to talk to Vicky about the Batley and Spen by-election broadly, because, of course, next week, when Boris Johnson faces Keir Starmer, we will know the result of that. And tell us what's at stake for both leaders.
Well, I think the Conservatives are feeling pretty optimistic, which many would say they shouldn't be, by rights. Remember, this is the seat, the previous seat of Jo Cox, the Labour MP who was murdered, and her sister is standing for the Labour Party. I mean, the atmosphere there from colleagues we know who've been there and visited, and from what we've seen, has not been pleasant. There's been quite a lot of aggression for people who are out campaigning. So all of that, I don't think, has been a particularly pleasant experience for the people involved. But the Conservatives confident, I think, partly because, again, and we saw this pattern in local elections and elsewhere, the vote on the left is being split, and it's allowing the Conservatives in some cases to do a little bit better.
And you can see all the candidates standing on the BBC website. I will be back tomorrow again at the earlier time, of course, of 9:15.